Thank you. Wanted to do a quick survey first. How many of you have actually shopped from Zappos before? Oh, wow. Very cool. So normally when I do this survey to a random audience, in understanding this one's a little different, the ratio is actually about 2 to 1 women to men. And a lot of guys I ask say they haven't personally shopped from us, but a lot of times their wives or significant others have, and actually a lot of times it's on their behalf. And I was giving a tour to an executive from one of the major record labels a few years ago at Zappos. And right now we're actually based in Henderson, which is a suburb of Las Vegas, and we're about a month away from moving to downtown, to the former City Hall, which I'll talk a little bit about. Would definitely encourage you guys, next time you're in town, to come take a tour of Zappos. We should be moved in by then, and we'll pick you up from the airport in a Zappos shuttle, give you a tour, and then drop you off at your hotel afterwards. And so I was giving this tour, and right now we're spread amongst 3 different buildings, and in the building I'm in, we go through the ground floor, which is our merchandising area, and then we go upstairs to our customer loyalty team, which is our name for our call center. And I asked him, had he shopped from Zappos before, and he said, no, he hadn't personally shopped from us, but he suspected his wife had, because these white boxes would show up on his doorstep, and then they disappear, and he had no idea what was going on. He didn't know if she was buying stuff or exchanging stuff or returning stuff, and every time he asked her, he would just flat out refuse. She would just flat out refuse to answer him and change the subject. So as I'm giving this tour on the second floor, there's this whiteboard that you'll see, and it has all different stats of our call center. Number of phone calls we took yesterday, percent of phone calls we answered in 20 seconds or less, sales through the call center, and so on. And as I'm going and explaining all these different stats to him, I turn around, and he's disappeared. And I'm like, oh, that's kind of weird. So I go back looking for him and look around for a little while. And then finally I find him. Turns out he had actually gone halfway down one of our aisles, sat down next to one of our customer service reps, and forced her to pull up his wife's account. And he discovered that she had spent over $62,000 in her lifetime. So hopefully we weren't instrumental to any divorce proceedings or anything like that. So actually, before getting into Zappos and then talking about Downtown Project, I wanted to talk about what led me to Zappos. And the story actually begins with pizza. This was during my college years. I lived in a dorm. There were probably 300 or 400 students in the dorm. And on the ground floor of the dorm, they had this kind of kitchen area, eating area set aside where every year students could bid on having the right to operate out of that space. And one year, my roommate Sanjay and I won the bidding, and we decided to get into the pizza business. And so that meant that we had to invest in pizza ovens, hire employees who were basically other students, deal with suppliers, and occasionally I was making the pizzas myself. And this guy named Alfred, who later on actually ended up becoming the CFO at Zappos, he would stop by every night. And this is actually how we met. He would stop by every night and order a large pepperoni pizza from me, which wasn't actually that weird. I had heard about Alfred's reputation for eating a lot. He had nicknames like Human Trash Compactor, Monster, and so on. And actually, later on, when we became friends, actually witnessed this myself. There'd be 10 of us late night at a Chinese restaurant somewhere, and he would literally finish everyone's leftovers. So not that weird, he would order a large pepperoni pizza, but then sometimes he'd come back a few hours later and order another large pepperoni pizza from me. And I thought, okay, he has to pull an all-nighter, or maybe he skipped breakfast. Well, I found out several years later, Alfred was taking the pizzas upstairs and selling them off by the slice. So that's why he became our CFO at Zappos later on. So that was the pizza business. And then after that, Sanjay and I got together and formed an internet advertising company called LinkExchange. And we grew that to about 100 or so people and then ended up selling the company to Microsoft 2.5 years later. But what a lot of people don't know is the real reason why we ended up selling the company. And the real reason is because it just ended up not being a fun place to work at anymore. And the company culture just went completely downhill. And I remember when it was just 5 or 10 of us, we were kind of your typical .com startup. We were working around the clock, sleeping under our desks, had no idea what day of the week it was. But it was actually really exciting as we started growing and then as we started hiring. And in our hiring strategies, we would hire friends and then friends of friends. And I remember there was one friend of mine that I had known since high school, and he was on this cross-country road trip from New York to Silicon Valley where we were, and we needed a little extra help for the weekend. And then that became a week, and then 2 weeks, and then eventually he actually ended up joining the company full-time and never made his way back to New York. And so this whole strategy of hiring friends and friends of friends actually worked really well for us until we got to about 20 people. And then we ran into a major problem. And the problem was we basically ran out of friends. So then we had to figure out how do you hire people based on interviews, resumes, and stuff we'd never really done before. We were fresh out of college. I think did a decent job in terms of hiring people based on the right skill sets and experiences, but we didn't know any better to pay attention to company culture. And by the time we got to 100 people, I myself dreaded getting out of bed in the morning to go to my own company, which was definitely a weird feeling. And then I was thinking, if I was feeling this way, how must all the other employees feel? So that's really what led us to sell the company. And shortly after sale, I left. Sanjay, the other co-founder, left. And in fact, most of the early employees all left within a few months. As it turned out, this was back in '98 during the whole the first dot-com boom and craziness. And so we got super lucky with the timing, and it worked out well financially. And I was in the position thinking, okay, what do I actually really want to do with my life now? And decided to get together with Alfred, and we decided to get into the investment business and invested in 20 or so different internet companies, of which Zappos just happened to be one of them. But then over the course of a year, I realized that actually for me, investing was kind of boring. I felt like I was sitting on the sidelines all the time, and I really missed being a part of building something. So within a year, I actually ended up joining full-time. I've been with Zappos ever since. Many of you may have heard that it was actually almost 4 years ago that Amazon acquired Zappos, but it's actually very different from most of their acquisitions. In most of their acquisitions, the plan is to integrate the company being acquired into the parent company, and then over time, the original company kind of loses its identity and joins the mothership. Whereas for us, we told them we'd only do it if Zappos could remain independent, if we can continue to have our own culture, our way of doing business, and our own separate brand, and they actually agreed to that. And I'm happy to report almost 4 years later, they've actually remained true to their word. And so if you look at the history of Zappos, we started out with no sales in '99. 2008 was the first time we hit $1 billion in gross merchandise sales. We're now doing well over $2 billion, almost $3 billion a year in gross merchandise sales. And the number one driver of all that growth has been through repeat customers and word of mouth. And our whole philosophy is really focus on the customer experience and customer service and think about how do we wow our customers and take most of the money that we would have normally spent on paid advertising and paid marketing and rather invest in that, invest into customer service and the customer experience, and then have our customers do the marketing for us through word of mouth. And for all this focus on customer service, though, the number one priority of the company is actually not customer service. Our number one priority is company culture, and our whole belief is that if we get the culture right, then most of the other stuff like delivering great customer service or building a long-term enduring brand or business will just be a natural byproduct of that. And there's a lot of stuff we do culturally in terms of hiring, firing, training, and so on. So in terms of how we think of our brand at Zappos, we have something internally we refer to as the 3 C's: clothing, customer service, and company culture. And the way we think about it is whether it's the happiness that customers feel from getting that perfect outfit or perfect pair of shoes, or the happiness that customers feel from getting great customer service, or the happiness that employees feel from being a part of a culture where the values of the company match their own personal values. The thing that we realize ties all of these 3 C's together is that Zappos is just about delivering happiness, whether it's to customers or employees, and we try to apply that same philosophy to our vendor partners as well, and hence the title of my book that came out a few years ago. Quick summary of my book. Actually, a lot of it is based on these 2 other books, Good to Great and Tribal Leadership, which I actually wish had existed prior to Zappos being founded, because it would have saved us a lot of trial and error. And for any of you that have not read those books, would highly recommend it. We even teach classes on these books to our own employees. That's how important I think these books are. And the reason why I think it's important is because the authors researched and looked at what separated the great companies in terms of long-term financial performance from just the good ones or mediocre ones. And they were actually kind of surprised by their findings. They found that the great companies had 2 important ingredients that the good ones or mediocre ones generally did not have. First ingredient was that the great companies all had strong cultures. And for us at Zappos, we formalized the definition of our culture into 10 core values. For anyone that wants a copy of this presentation, I'll make it available later. But what was really interesting about the research, because a lot of times people come through, they tour our offices and say, okay, happy for you, Zappos, you have this strong culture, and made the Fortune best companies to work for list, and so on. But the stuff you're talking about would actually never work at my company. Like, we can't have all these crazy decorations and parades and so on that you might see at a Zappos office. But what was really interesting about the research, I thought, was that they found that it actually doesn't matter what your values are. What matters is that you have them, and the power actually comes from the alignment that you get from actually having values and being able to hire and fire people based on values completely independent of their actual job performance. So advice to any entrepreneurs out there is really, and for us at Zappos, we actually didn't roll out our values formally for several years. And if I could do it all over again, I would do it from the beginning. Because it was actually one of those things a lot of us, myself included, kind of resisted in the early days because it felt like one of those big corporate things that big corporations do. The second ingredient that they found through the research that separated the great companies in terms of long-term financial performance from just the good ones or mediocre ones, the second ingredient I actually found really counterintuitive. The second ingredient they found was that the great companies all had a vision that had a higher purpose beyond just money or profits or being number one in market or beating the competition. And the ironic thing is, by actually having a vision that had a higher purpose beyond profits, it actually enabled these companies to generate significantly more profits than their peer group. And so sometimes I'll get approached by entrepreneurs that ask, oh, what's a good market to get into where I can make a lot of money? And my advice to them is actually, rather than have money be your primary motivator, think about what would you be so passionate about doing that you'd be happy doing it for 10 years, even if you didn't make any money from it, and that's what you should be doing.